Chapter 4. Erland Nicolausson held the post of captain of the Vargoy stronghold and keeper of the northern marches for well nigh 2 years. In all that time he came not further south than to Vargoy, and that but once, when he and Sir Erling Vidkundsen had made tryst there. The second summer Erland was in the north. Hemming Alfson died at last, and Erland was made warden of Orkdal county in his stead. Hafthor Grout went north to take his place at Vargoy. Erland was a glad man when he sailed for the south, some days after Mary's Mass in autumn. It was the cure for his honour that he had wished for all these years, to be given the wardenship his father once held. Not that this had been a goal he had ever wittingly worked to reach, but it had ever seemed to him that 'twas this he needed, so that he might come into the place where he rightfully belonged, both in his own and in his fellows' eyes. Now 'twas no matter if men still deemed him to be somewhat unlike the other, the home-keeping nobles. There was no disgrace in the unlikeness any more. And he longed to be home. Things had been more peaceful in Finnmarken than he had looked for. Even the first winter had worn on him. He sat there idle in the castle, and could do nothing at that season toward the mending and bettering of the works. They had been put in good order 17 years before, but now were quite fallen in ruin. Then came the spring and summer, with life and bustle, meetings here and there in the fjords with the Norse and half-Norse tax-gatherers, and the spokesmen from the tribes of the uplands. Erland roved the seas and fjords with his 2 ships, and amused himself royally. On the island the houses were mended and the works strengthened. But the next year there was but little to do. Hafthor would see to it, doubtless, that the quiet did not last long. Erland laughed. They had sailed together eastward well nigh as far as Trianima, and there had Hafthor taken a Russian Lapwoman and had brought her back with him. Erland had talked to him gravely. He must remember 'twas above all needful that the heathen should understand always that we were the masters, and to that end, seeing one had but a handful of men, one must bear one so as not to stir up trouble needlessly. No making or meddling should the Lapps fight and slay each other. That pleasure one must let them enjoy in peace. But be ever ready to pounce like a hawk on Russians and Kolbjags and whatever else the pack might call themselves. And leave the women folk in peace. For one thing they were witches, every one, and for another there were enough to profit themselves. But the Godoy lad must steer his course as he would. He would learn in time. Hafthor was joyful at getting free from his farms and his wife, and now Erland was fain to come home to his. He had a right blissful longing now for Kristin and Huseby and his own countryside and all his children, for all things at his home where Kristin was. At Lingsford he heard tidings of a ship with some monks aboard. 'Twas said that they were preaching friars from Nidaros who were journeying north, bent on planting the true faith amidst the heathen and heretics of the marches. Erland felt sure within him that Gunoff was one of the company. And true enough, 3 nights later, he sat alone with his brother in an earthen hut on a little Norse farm that lay by the strand where they had met. Erland was strangely moved. He had heard Mass and taken the sacrament with his crew, the only time since he came here to the north, save that once when he had been at Vargoy. The church at Vargoy was without a priest. A deacon had been left in the fort, and he had striven to keep count of the holy days for them, but else there had been but scurvy provisioned for the souls of the Norsemen in these northern lands. They must even comfort themselves with the thought that it was a crusade of a kind they were on, and 'twas like they would not be held to such strict account for their sins. He sat speaking to Gunoff of this, and his brother listened with a far-off, strange smile on his wide, thin lips. It looked as if he ever sucked in the underlip a little, as a man may often do when he is thinking hard of some matter, and is nigh to understanding, but has not yet come to full clearness in his thoughts. The night was far spent already. All other folks on the farm were sleeping up in the shed. The brothers knew that they alone were waking, and they were both stirred by the strangeness of their sitting here, they two alone. The roaring of the sea and of the storm came to them lulled and deadened by the turf walls. Now and then a puff of wind would force its way in, blowing up the embers in the fireplace and flapping the flame of the train oil lamp a little. There were no furnishings in the hut. The brothers sat on the low earthen bench that ran around 3 sides of the room, and between them lay Gunoff's writing-board, with inkhorn, feather pen, and a roll of parchment. Gunoff had been writing down one thing and another his brother had told him of trysting-places and settled farms, of sailing marks and weather signs and words in the Lapps tongues, just as the thing chanced to come into Erland's mind. Gunoff commanded the ship. She was named the Sunniva, for the preaching brothers had chosen Saint Sunniva as garden saint for their mission. "Aye, if only you come not to the same end as the Selgie men," said Erland, and again Gunoff smiled a little. "You tell me I am restless, Gunoff," Erland went on. "What should a man call you, then? First you go wandering about in the Southlands all those years, and no sooner are you come home, but you must needs turn your back on living and prebends, and be off to preach to the devil and all his imps away north in Veliar. You know not their tongue, and they don't understand yours. Methinks you are yet more unstable than I." "I have neither goods nor kin to answer for," said the monk. "I have loosed me now from all bonds. But you have been bound, brother." "Oh, aye. He is the free man who owns nothing." Gunoff answered, "All things that a man owns hold him far more than he holds them." "Nay, by God, 'tis not ever so. I grant you that Kristin holds me. But I have no mind that my lands and my children should own me." "Don't think that way, brother," said Gunoff low, "for then may it easily come to pass that you lose them." "Nay, I have no mind to grow like to all those other good men, sticking up to their ears in the mud of their lands," said Erland, laughing, and again his brother smiled a little. "Fairer children than Ivar and Skule I have never seen," he spoke. "I think this was how you must have looked at their age. No marvel that our mother loved you so much." Each brother rested a hand on the writing-board that lay between them. Even in the faint light of the train oil lamp it could be seen how unlike these two men's hands were. The monks, bare of rings and all adornments, white and sinewy, smaller and much more closely set than the others, looked also much stronger, though Erland's fist was as hard as horn in the palm, and the bluish-white scar of an arrow wound furrowed the dark flesh from the wrist up under the sleeve. But the fingers of his narrow, brown-tanned hand, dry and knotted at the joints like the twigs of trees, were covered with golden and jewelled rings. Erland would fain have taken his brother's hand, but he was ashamed, so he just drank, pulling a wry face over the bad beer. "She seemed to you to be well and hearty again, was Kristin?" Erland asked in a while. "Aye, she blossomed like a rose when I was at Huseby in the summer," said the monk, smiling a little. He waited a while, then said gravely, "One thing I would pray you, brother, to think somewhat more of Kristin's and the children's welfare than you have done till now, and be counselled by her and clinch the bargains that she and Sira Eilif have agreed for. They wait but for your assent to close them. I do not like too much these plans of hers you speak of, said Erland haltingly. And now, too, my standing will be other than it has been. Your lands will be of more worth when you bring your holdings close together, answered the monk. Methought Kristin's counsels were wise when she told me of the matter. I warrant there is scarce a woman in Norway's land that is freer than she to guide things as she will, said Erland. In the end 'tis you that guide things, answered the monk. And you guide Kristin too, as you will, he added in a low voice. Erland laughed softly, low in his throat, stretched himself, and yawned. Then, of a sudden, he said soberly, You have guided her too at times, my brother, and I marvel if sometimes your counsels have come near to parting our friendship. Mean you the friendship that has been betwixt you and your wife, or the friendship between us two brothers? Said the monk slowly. Both, said Erland, as if it was a thought that but now had come to him. So wholly there is sure no need for a lay woman to be, he said more lightly. I have counselled her as I deem to be best, as is best, he corrected himself. Erland looked at the monk in the preaching brother's coarse grey-white frock, with the black cowl thrown back, so that it lay in thick folds round the neck and over the shoulders. The crown of the head was shaven now, so that there was but a narrow fringe of hair about the lean, round, pallid face. But the hair was thick and black as in Gunoff's earliest youth. Aye, you are no brother of mine now, I think, any more than you are brother to all mankind, said Erland, and wondered at the deep bitterness in his own voice. So it is not, though so it should be. So help me God, almost I believe 'tis therefore you would go to dwell among the Lapps, said Erland. Gunoff bent his head. There was a glow in his yellow-brown eyes. And that is the reason. In some measure, he said, low and quickly. They spread out the skins and rugs they had brought with them. It was too cold and raw in the hut for them to take off any clothes, so they bade each other good night, and lay down on the earthen bench, which, to escape the smoke that hung above, was but little raised above the floor. Erland lay thinking of the tidings that had come to him from home. 'Twas not much he had heard in these 2 years. 2 letters from his wife had come to his hands, but they had been old already when they reached him. Sarah Eilif had written them for her. She could print herself, fair and plain, but she was ever loath to write, since it seemed to her scarce seemly for an unlearned woman. Doubtless she would be yet holier, now they had a new shrine in their neighbourhood parish, and that sacred to a man whom she herself had known in his life. And now gout had found healing for his sickness there, and she herself won her full health again, after being sickly ever since the birth of the twins. Gunoff had told him that the preaching friars at Hamar had at last been forced to give back Edvin Rickardson's body to his brethren at Oslo, and these were now having full record made of all things concerning brother Edvin's life, and the miracles 'twas said he had wrought, both in life and after he was dead. It was their intent to send this writing to the Pope and try to have the monk beatified. Some peasants from Gaudal and Medeldal had gone south and borne witness to wonders that brother Edvin had wrought in their parishes by his intercession, and by means of a crucifix that he had carved out and that now was at Medelhus. They had vowed to build a little church on Vatsfjeld, where he had lived some summers as a hermit, and where was a healing spring that owed to him its virtue. So they were given a hand from his body to enshrine in the church. Kristin had made offering of 2 silver cups, and of the great clasp set with blue stone that had come to her from her mother's mother, Ulvhild Havarsdatter, and had had Tidekin Paus, the goldsmith in the city, make of them a silver hand to hold the bones of brother Edvin's hand and fingers. And she had been at the Vatsfeld with Sarah Eilif and her children, and a great following, when the Archbishop hallowed the church at St. John's Mass tide the year after Erland had gone northward. After this, Gout had gained health swiftly, and had learnt to walk and talk. He was now like other children of his age. Erland stretched himself. Sure, it was the greatest joy that could have befallen them that Gout was grown whole and well. He would give some land to that church. Gout was fair, Gunoff said, and comely of face like his mother. Pity that he had not been a little maid, then should he have been called Mahnhild. He was fain now to see all these fair sons of his too. Gunoff Nicolausson lay thinking of the spring day 3 years back, when he had ridden up toward Huseby. On the road he met a man from the manor. The mistress was not at home, he said. She was with a sick woman. He rode along a narrow grassy path between old stick fences. There were young leaf trees covering the steep clay banks, both above him and down towards the river that ran below in the bottom, loud with the spring freshets. He rode toward the sun, and the tender green leaves glanced like golden flames on the twigs. But farther in the wood the shade lay cool and deep already on the grassy sward. He rode on till he caught a glimpse of the lake lying below him, and mirroring darkly the farther shore, with the heavens all blue, and the picture of the great summer clouds ruffled and broken by the current ripples. Deep down below the bridle path lay a little farm on the green flower-sprinkled slopes. A group of white-coiffed housewives stood out in the courtyard, but Kristin was not amongst them. A little farther on he saw her horse. It was loose in the close along with some others. The path dipped down in front of him into a hollow filled with green shadow, and where it wound up over the next billow of the clay banks, she was standing by the fence under the leaves, listening to the bird's song. He saw her slender black-clad shape bent over the fence in towards the wood. Only the coif and an arm showed white. He reined in his horse and rode on towards her at foot-pace, but when he came near, he saw that it was the trunk of an old birch tree that stood there. The next evening, when his serving folk sailed him into the city, the priest himself was at the helm. He felt his heart firm and, as it were, new-born in his breast. Nothing now could shake his purpose. He knew then that what had held him back, had kept him in the world, was the unquenchable longing he had borne within him from his boyhood up, the longing to win the love of men. That he might be beloved, he had been generous, mild, and mirthful with small folk. He had let his light of learning shine, but with all modesty and humility, among the priests in the city, so that they might like him. He had been compliant with Lord Eilif Courtin, since the Archbishop had been a friend of his father's, and he knew how Lord Eilif liked those around him to behave. He had been kindly and gentle with Orm, to win a little of the boy's love away from his fitful father. And he had been stern and unsparing with Kristin, because he knew that she had needed to meet with somewhat that did not give way when she grasped at it for support, something that did not lead her astray when she came forward ready to follow. But that evening he had understood. He had sought to win her trust in himself far more than to strengthen her trust in God. Erland had found the word tonight. Not my brother more than all men's brother. That was the way he must go before his brotherly love could profit any. 2 weeks later he had parted all his goods between his kin and the church, and taken on the habit of a professed preaching brother. And last spring, when all souls were deeply shaken by the fearful calamity that had fallen on the land, the lightning had struck Christ Church in Nidaros and half consumed St. Olaf's house, Gunoff had won the Archbishop's support for his old plan. Along with Brother Olaf Jonsson, who was a consecrated priest like himself, and 3 younger monks, 1 from Nidaros and 2 from the preaching convent in Bjorgvin, he was now journeying northward to bring the light of the word to the unhappy heathen who lived and died in gross darkness within the boundaries of a Christian land. Christ, thou crucified one, now have I given from me everything that could bind me. Myself I have given into thy hands, if thou wilt deign with my life to buy Satan's household free. Take me in such wise that I feel I am thy thrall, for so shall I possess thee. And so should his heart, maybe, one day sing and shout in his breast, as it had sung and exulted when he walked the green plains by Romaborg, from pilgrim's church to pilgrim's church. I am my beloved's, and to him is my desire. The two brothers lay, each on his bench in the little hut, thinking and thinking until they slept. A live ember on the hearth between them glowed faintly. Their thoughts drew them farther and farther away, one from the other. And the next day the one set forth for the north, and the other southward. Erland had promised Hafthor Grout to sail round by Godoy, and take Hafthor's sister with him southward. She was wed to Torolf Assulson of Lensvik. He too was a kinsman of Erland's, but far off. The first morning, when Margeigren stood out of Godoy Sound, her sail bellying against the background of blue mountains in the fine breeze, Erland stood on the afterdeck, and Ulf Haldarsson was at the helm. Lady Sunniva came up on deck. She had thrown back the hood of her cloak, and the wind blew the linen of her coif backwards, uncovering her curly, sun-bright yellow hair. She had the same sea-blue glittering eyes as her brother, and like him she was fair of face, but thickly freckled both on her face and her small, plump hands. From the first evening he saw her at Godoy, their eyes had met, and then they had looked aside, a secret smile on each face. Erland had been assured that she knew him, and he knew her. Sunniva Olafsdatter. He could take her with his bare hands, and she looked for him to do it. Now, as he stood with her hand in his, he had helped her up, he chanced to look at Ulf's rough, dark face. Ulf knew it too, he could see. He was strangely abashed at the man's look. He remembered in a flash all this kinsman and henchman of his had been privy to in his life. Every coil his folly had snared him in from earliest youth up. He thought, Ulf had no need to look so scornfully at him, as though he had meant to be more free with the lady than right and honour would allow. He was old enough now, and wise enough from such burning of his fingers, to be let loose in Halagerland without tangling him up in witless folly with the wife of another. He had a wife himself now. He had been true to Kristin from the first day he had seen her till now. One or two matters that had befallen away in the north, no reasonable man would bring into the account. Else had he not once looked at a woman in such wise. He knew it himself, with a Norse woman, and their equal in birth to boot. No, he would never have an hour's peace of mind if he was false to Kristin in such wise. But this voyage southward with her on board, it might well be perilous. It was some help to him that they met with rough weather along the coast, so that he had somewhat else to do other than dally with the lady. At Dinoy they had to take shelter and tarry there in the harbour some days. And while they lay there a thing befell which made Lady Sunniva seem much less alluring. Erland, with Ulf and one or two other men, slept in the same shed where she and her women lay. One morning he was alone in there, and the lady was not yet risen. She called to him. She said she had lost a finger ring in the bed. He had to come and help her search. She was creeping about on the bed. They turned towards each other now and then in their search, and each time they had that lurking smile in their eyes. But when she took hold of him, he had maybe not borne himself in seemly wise. Time and place were against it. But she was so bold and shameless that now of a sudden he grew hard and cold. Red with shame, he looked away from her face of laughter and wantonness, freed himself with scant excuse, then went out and sent in the ladies' serving women to her. No, devil take it, he was not so young a bird as to be caught with chaff. 'Twas one thing to beguile, quite another thing to be beguiled. But he could not but laugh. Here he stood, and he had just fled away from a fair dame, like yonder Hebrew Joseph. Aye, strange things befall both by sea and land. Ah, he could not but remember one whom he knew. She had gone to tryst with him in a house of call for ribald men-at-arms, and she had come shamefast and worshipful as a young maid of kingly birth might go to mass. In woods and barns had she met him. God forgive him, he had forgotten her birth and her honour, and she had forgotten them for his sake. But she had not been able to fling them from her. Her blood rose up and spoke in her, even when she thought not on it. God bless thee, my Kristin. So help me God, my faith that I pledge thee in secret and before the altar, that will I keep, or never more be called a man. So be it. He landed Lady Sunniva soon after at Urjar, where she had kinsfolk. The best of the matter was that she seemed not too angry either when they parted. He had had no need to hang his head and mope like a monk. They had had much frolic and dalliance on the way. At parting he gave the lady some costly pelts for a cloak, and she promised he should see her in the cloak. They would surely meet now and then. Poor woman, her husband was sickly and no longer young. But he was happy that he was coming home to his wife, and had nothing on his mind that he need hide from her. And he was proud of his well-proved steadfastness. And he was dizzy and mad with longing for Kristin. She was the sweetest and loveliest of roses and lilies after all, and she was his. Kristin was at the landing place to meet him when Erland came in to Bergsea. Fishers had brought word to Vig that Margeigeren had been seen out at Urjar. She had her 2 eldest sons and Margaret with her, and at home in Huseby all was making ready for a great banquet to friends and kinsmen for Erland's welcome home. She was grown so fair that Erland caught his breath when he saw her. But 'twas true, she was changed. The girlish look that had still come back to her after she had come through each child-bed, the tender, frail, nun-like look under the matron's coif, was gone. She was a young, blooming wife and mother. Her cheeks were round and freshly red between the white lappets of her coif, her bosom full and firm for chains and brooches to glitter on. Her thighs were rounder and fuller under the key-belt and the gilded case that held knife and scissors. Yes, yes, she had grown more fair. She didn't look now as though they could blow her away from him to heaven so lightly as before. Even the long, narrow hands were grown fuller and more white. They tarried at Vig for the night in the abbot's house there, and it was a young, rosy and joyful Kristin, mild and beaming with happiness, that went with him this time to the feast at Huseby, when they rode homeward next day. There were many grave matters she should have spoken of to her husband when he came home. There were 1,000 things about their children, misgivings for Margaret, and there were her plans for putting the estates on their feet again. But all was swallowed up in the whirl of festivity. They passed around from one banquet to another, and she bore the warden company on his progresses. Erland kept now yet more men at Huseby, for messages and letters were ever passing betwixt him and his sheriffs and deputies. All the time Erland was joyous and reckless as ever. How should he not be the very man for warden, he asked, he that had run his head against well-nigh every rule in the law of the land and the church's law? Hardly learned was well remembered. The man was of a quick and ready wit. He had been well taught in boyhood, and now this stood him in good stead. He used himself to read his own letters, and took an Icelander into service as scribe. Till now he had been wont to set his seal to whatever others read out to him, and he was ever loath to look on a line of writing. Kristin had seen much of the fruits of this in these 2 years in which she had made acquaintance with all the papers in his chests. But now there came on Kristin a recklessness, the like of which she had never known. She grew livelier and less still in her mien when she was out among strangers, for she felt herself very fair, and she was healthful and fresh for the first time since she had been wed. And at nights when Erland and she lay in a strange bed in a loft on one of the great folks' manors or in the hall of a farm, they laughed and whispered and made sport of the folk they had met, and jested over tidings they had heard. Erland's tongue was more devil-may-care than ever, and folk seemed to like him better than ever before. She saw it in their own children. They were almost spellbound with delight when their father would now and again take notice of them. Narkvi and Björgulf did nothing now but play with bows and spears and axes and such gear. And it might chance now and then that their father would stop in crossing the courtyard, look at their games, and put them right. "Not like that, my son. Hold it this way." He changed the grip of the little fist and placed the fingers as they should be. When this happened, they were beside themselves with eagerness. The 2 eldest sons were not to be parted. Björgulf was the biggest and strongest of the children, as tall as Narkvi, who was 3.5 years older and stouter than he. He had tight curled raven black hair. His little face was broad but comely, the eyes dark blue. One day Erland asked their mother, somewhat fearfully, if she knew that Björgulf had not good sight in one eye, and that he had the slightest squint too. Kristin said she believed not there was much amiss. 'Twas like he would grow out of it. Things had so fallen out that she had always made least ado with this child. He had been born when she was worn out with nursing Narkvi, and gout followed so close on his heels. He was the strongest of the children, and, it seemed, the quickest-witted, but he was most silent. And Erland was fondest of this son. Though he did not make it clear to himself, he had a little grudge against Narkvi, because the boy had come at an untoward time, and because he had to be called after his grandfather. And gout was not as he looked to find him. The boy had a great head, as was but reason, since for 2 years 'twas the only part of him that had grown. Now his body and limbs were making up their growth. His wits were good enough, but he talked very slowly, for if he spoke fast he began to lisp or stammer, and then Margaret mocked at him. Kristin was most fond of this boy, though Erland could see that, in a manner, the eldest was still dearest to her. But gout had been so ailing, and he favoured her father somewhat with his flaxen hair and dark grey eyes, and he was ever at his mother's skirts. He was a little lonely between the 2 elder boys, who held together always, and the twins, who were still so small that they were always with their foster-mothers. Kristin had less time now to care for her children, and she was forced to do more as other ladies did, and let the serving women look after them. But the 2 eldest ran about for choice among the men on the farm. She no longer brooded over them with the old, overwrought tenderness, but she laughed and played with them more when she had time to gather them about her. At the New Year there came to Huseby a letter under Lavrans Björgulfsson's seal. It was written with his own hand, and had been sent by the priest of Orkadal, who had been south. So 'twas 2 months old. The weightiest news it brought was that he had betrothed Ramborg to Simon Anderson of Formo. The wedding was appointed for the spring, at the time of the Feast of Holy Cross. Kristin was amazed beyond measure, but Erland said he had thought things might go thus, ever since he had heard that Simon Dar was left a widower, and had come to live on his manor in Sill after Sir Old Andrus Gudmundsson's death.